16 of the fantasy football season. Here's a few quarterbacks I will bench. At the time of recording this video, no one's been placed on the COVID list. And I know this thing's been running rapidly here. And guys, every hour are going on. But right now, time of recording this, no one's on the list. The first guy I would bench this week's Kirk Cousins of the Minnesota Vikings. So Kirk Cousins here, he's been up and down the last few games here. But he was very consistent for the first 10, 11 weeks of the fantasy season. So the last few weeks for him, week 13 at Detroit, 340 pass yards, 2 touchdowns, 6 rushing yards, a fumble loss. Week 14 versus Pittsburgh, 216 pass yards, 2 touchdowns, 2 interceptions. And week 15 at Chicago, a very underwhelming ball game, 87 pass yards, 2 touchdowns, an interception, and 10 rushing yards. So right here, he's banged up a little with a rib injury. But Kirk Cousins, the one thing I'll give him, this guy's a gamer, and he plays pretty much through any injury here. So right here, he's got a tough matchup at home in Week 16 versus the Los Angeles Rams that give up the 4th least amount of fantasy points to quarterbacks. And this Ram team, I think they're starting to hit their stride. Their main 3 big guys are back now in the lineup after they were on the protocol list. And I could see it being tough sledding here for Cousins, especially if Adam Thielen's out again in this game, which he'll probably be questionable with his ankle injury going into this week. So with Cousins struggling over the last few weeks here and a tough matchup versus a good Ram defense, I wouldn't trust him in a big situation here in your semi-finals of your fantasy week. The next quarterback's Ryan Tannehill of the Tennessee Titans. So the Titans got a tough matchup, in my opinion, versus the San Francisco 49ers here tonight that give up the 12th least amount of fantasy points to quarterbacks. But Ryan Tannehill, I know A.J. Brown's most likely playing tonight. I know Julio Jones back, but that's not saying much. Julio Jones the whole season here has looked like a shelf of himself here. And he's been a guy that's been banged up the whole season, so I really can't count on him. The last few games here for Tannehill, Week 12 in New England, 93 pass yards, a touchdown, and didn't throw 24 yards rushing. Week 14 versus Jacksonville, 191 pass yards, 29 yards rushing, and a touchdown. And then last week at Pittsburgh, 153 pass yards, and didn't throw 18 yards rushing, a touchdown rushing, and a fumble loss. So right here, even with his weapons back this week, I don't think he's having a big game. And how could you really count on Tannehill after the last few games here? His highest fantasy day was 16 fantasy points in the last 4 weeks. I know Brown's been out and he's back, but still in a big situation as well. I can't trust him this week. And the third and final quarterback I will bench this week's Tua Tagovailoa of the Miami Dolphins. So Tua last week had a slam dunk matchup versus the New York Jets, and he didn't do much in that ball game until it seems like he maxes out at 21 fantasy points this season here. So the last few games for him, Week 12 versus Carolina, 230 pass yards, a touchdown. Week 13 versus the Giants, 244 pass yards, 2 touchdowns. And Week 15 versus the Jets, 196 pass yards, 2 touchdowns, 2 interceptions, and only 19 yards rushing. So the thing with me here, Tua's not running the football a lot, which is a little bit surprising, in my opinion, where he's not getting a lot of those goal line touchdowns, and he's just not running in general. He's looking to throw the ball, which is a good thing and a bad thing, because I thought Tua coming out of college was more of a runner than he is in the NFL right now. But this week here, tough matchup in New Orleans. Monday Night Football. This Saint defense, for the most part, has been solid this season here. And I think this week here, they're going to lower Tua down to probably only 12, 17 fantasy points at most. And no way in a semifinal matchup you want that as your starting quarterback. So that's a few quarterbacks I will bench here for Week 16 of the fantasy football season.